Hello, my name is Arushi. I was an attorney last year, and this year I'm the prosecution captain. And today we're going to be talking to you guys about how to analyze case packets in mock trial.
I'm Karen. Last year, I was also a prosecution attorney, and this year, I am the prosecution assistant captain. So let's get started with how to analyze case packets. So we're going to start with some basic steps or what you should do immediately after getting your case packet. Now, the first thing is to read the fact situation very carefully, which is located at the really front of the packet before any of the witness statements. So this fact situation is kind of like the foundation and basis to everything you need to know for the entire crime or the entire case. And although it doesn't give you much information when it comes to trying to build your script, trying to build your case, trying to find like one side of the story, it is enough for you to know the foundation, for you to be able to move on and like go on to further things like analyzing and looking into each witness. So it's really crucial when you're trying to fully understand the story, and it's kind of like the baseline for you to know. So, for example, from last year's fact situation, we learned that Lee Crotty is a journalist who has a YouTube channel that Remy Montoya also follows. And, Lee Crotty made a private group chat that included Remy, and they gave like sneak peeks of their videos. And so in one specific video, Crotty showed documents with Drew Marshak's address and demanded to quote unquote take what's ours. And eventually, private message Remy Montoya telling them to go into the house to take the documents, which Remy did, breaking in. And then Remy then took the briefcase to Crotty's meet and greet, where Crotty then took them back to their home and gave them refuge for the night. Officer Bird then arrested Remy the next morning at Crotty's home. So kind of gives like a step-to-step rundown of exactly what happened. This is like the baseline information that you need to know to be able to understand further when you read each person's perspective. And the second step is to read the main witnesses' witness statements. So this kind of gives an understanding of what each side's main case will be, since most of the time your case surrounds who your main witness is and what they say about themselves. So there are like different hints, different, aspects that you should look at when you're trying to analyze, what will your main storyline be surrounding and what will your main storyline say about your characters. So again, last year, Remy Montoya's witness statement kind of described themselves as a passionate, innocent fan who, followed everything Crotty wanted them to do, but they themselves didn't really have intention in committing all the crimes. So they were always anxious and they were conveniently handed all of the necessary information to go through with all the crimes. So just reading based on that witness statement, you know where you need to go with it, you know how you want to portray Montoya, and you know what the prosecution side will look like in terms of trying to prove Lee Crotty's like guiltiness. And then on the other side, on Lee Crotty's side, they were described as a successful YouTuber who didn't know Montoya that well, had no clue of anything that was happening, and was just miscommunication and, like different information being spread on both sides. And so that also for the defense, you know what their main argument will look like. And it gives you a baseline for what you're trying to do, what your starting point is on each side. And the third one is to read through all of the witness statements on your side, also on the other side. And in order to really give a full story, in order to be able to argue your point best, you need to know all the evidence, all the information there is. And of course, that all comes in all the witness statements. And so, with reading on both sides of the situations, you can find holes, you can find more storyline, you can find different perspectives on things, which is very, very necessary when you're trying to come up with a complete story. So, for example, when reading last year's case packet, Crotty stated that he had no clue what Remy did, and they kind of like made themselves away from the storyline. Kind of said that I didn't have anything to do with it. But when you read the prosecution side, when you read Officer Bird's statement, you realize that after Officer Bird arrested Remy, the first thing Crotty said was, "What did Remy take?" And after when he was sitting in the back of Officer Bird's car, he was like being super defensive. And so obviously reading those two, they kind of contradict, and you would start asking yourself, is this reality? Is this, is this what Crotty really said? Or is there more that you need to dig and more holes that you need to continue finding? And in addition to that, a lot of the times for witnesses on your side, so for example prosecution witnesses, in their statement they tend to mention themselves in a positive light. So what that means is they tend to say themselves as innocent, or they tend to say one side of the story, and in order to build up a full argument, in order to say everything you need, in order for all the information you need to come up with a solid storyline, you need both sides. And if you look at the defensive witnesses statements based on that witness, you kind of realize more of the full story. You realize a full circle of who that character is, what you need to protect about that character, and what is the positive things that you can, fully develop.
Cool. So you're probably wondering like what to do after you understand the case packet, like kind of after you know the main storyline of, I guess, the case for this certain year. But there's like a lot of steps that you should take. So we've kind of broken it down into 5 main ones. The first one is about brainstorming ideas for possible arguments on on both sides, the prosecution and the defense. So we recommend writing a list of about 4 per side to, oh, sorry, can you go to the next slide? So we recommend writing like 4 per side for the prosecution and the defense, regardless of what side you're actually on. These arguments are like generally the ones that you're kind of thinking of as you read the witness statement. So like as you're reading them, you can like pick up on certain things that like stick out to you, or that you think could be like that you could be making arguments off of. Additionally, you should be separating your arguments into 2 categories: generics and unique argument, because obviously on a certain case, there's going to be like generic arguments that a lot of people are going to read just like by the way that the case packet is written, and just by like the main arguments that are made clear in the main witness's witness statement, which is also why it's really important to focus on those, like Karen had mentioned. But separating it into generics and unique arguments is like really important and useful to the team, because when we all come together at the team meetings and like discuss all of the arguments that we've come up with to choose our finalized themes and our final like 2 to 3 main ideas that we're going to be like focusing on for the entirety of the trial, we can like better understand which arguments to prepare for and which arguments that our team should be focusing on if your arguments are separated into generics and unique arguments. So that kind of leads me on to the theme idea. These arguments are obviously not the ones that we're going to be using for the whole trial, the arguments that you come up with, I mean, but rather these are the ones that you're going to be presenting to the team. So like you shouldn't just be taking the arguments that you come up with and trying to frame your questions around these arguments, but rather you should be trying to frame them around the main theme that the team decides on after you've presented your arguments to the team. That's really important because a lot of teams generally like have questions that kind of tell a different story for each witness that may support like the defense, or that all may support the prosecution. But if it doesn't give like a cohesive story to the judge, there's like no clear reason as to why they should vote for either the prosecution or the defense. So it's really important to remember that your argument ideas are not the ones that you should be going for like when writing your direct and cross examinations, like for sure, but rather you should be focusing on the 2 or 3 that we decide on as a team. So next we're going to talk about how to incorporate these main ideas. One thing you should always be focusing on is the storyline. So you want to tell a very clear story to the judge. You want to make it very obvious to them that this person is at fault or this person is not at fault. So you want to like frame your questions in a way that will like tell that storyline on its own. You should always be like thinking to yourself and like asking yourself, how is my witness contributing to this overall story, rather than thinking, what does this witness say that can provide a new reason to vote for the prosecution or the defense? You should be focusing on the main idea at all times and like trying to find clues within the witness statement to support the main idea. So rather than like making arguments based off of the evidence, you should be using the evidence to support the main idea that we've kind of already chosen. So a couple of ways that you can do this through existing witness statements in the case packet are by looking for specific lines, first of all, which I guess should be pretty self-explanatory. But secondly, like personality. Obviously, like the way a witness presents themselves can tell a lot about the main idea, or who's guilty and who's not guilty. Like for example, if I portray myself as a very like shy person who like was really confused, didn't really know what was happening, and when I answer questions that way, then like obviously the judge is going to be like, this person probably isn't at fault. So next we're going to be kind of leading on with that, talking about witness character traits. So you should be thinking about like who your witness is, like not like their name, like not Remy and Toya, but like who are they? Like what kind of person are they? Like are they a cousin of the main victim, or a family, or an enemy? Like how does that person like relate to the storyline as a whole? And additionally, you should be thinking like what kind of person does this witness have to be in order to support the prosecution or the defense? Like what do they have to be thinking for the prosecution arguments to be true, or for the defense arguments to be true? And you should be trying to portray those emotions in the answers that you write and the answers that you give to direct examination questions and cross-examination questions. Additionally, these are obviously like shouldn't be written out. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but you should try to, I guess, like express that in your own way each time rather than like writing down your emotions. But more on that later. In addition to personality and like speaking style, another thing you should focus on is like confidence level. So I know like it may seem that if your witness like is supposed to be shy, you should like obviously try to show like a shy character, but that doesn't mean you should let your own confidence as like an actor for the witness drop. So there's a difference between like you as the actor for the character like losing confidence, and the character themselves having like a low self-esteem or something. So you should remember that when you're trying to play a shy character, you should still like know what you're talking about, make it clear that like you know your role and you've practiced it, and so that it doesn't like look that like you as a person don't really know what you're doing like in the trial itself. So next we're going to talk about like how to actually incorporate these emotions into the like answers that you read as a witness and in the questions that you write as an attorney. First of all, memorization is key because as I mentioned earlier, you shouldn't be like writing down your emotions. It's really hard to show that your emotions are genuine if you're like reading them off of a page. Like for example, I've often seen teams like in their pre-written direct and cross examinations, they'll write like the answer and then they'll write pause and then continue on. Like obviously if you're like reading off a doc and then you just pause, it seems pretty obvious that you're not being genuine with those emotions. But rather if you're trying to portray a character who is, I guess, like going through a lot, maybe they're suffering, you kind of want to be able to accept those emotions. But in order to do that, you have to like memorize first, which is why like memorization is going to be really important this year because we want to improve our witnesses like emotional skills. Lastly, practice is obviously key because you can't accept your emotions the first time and expect it to come off as like real. So you should be trying to memorize before the first practice trial that we do so that you can practice accepting your emotions in trial rather than practicing memorizing your lines, if that makes sense. Another thing to point out or just to keep in mind is the personality that you kind of choose for your witness to have shouldn't be like decided on your own. You should definitely talk to the rest of the team about it because you don't want to have like two witnesses that give off the exact same vibe or two witnesses that give off like totally different vibes that like don't make sense in the context of the round. You want it all to kind of match together. And additionally, you probably like want to talk to the opposing team to determine like what kind of personality I guess they would need your witness to have in order for their argument to be true and try to counteract that. Lastly, this is kind of probably a little bit self-explanatory, but it is often overlooked in a lot of teams, and I think it's really important. And that's like working with closing. So you should be thinking about what the goal is of your cross examination or your direct examination, because closing is like the last thing that the judges hear in the trial. It's what they're going to be basing their decisions off of, essentially, because that's where all of the main arguments and the answers from the cross examinations and direct examinations are kind of all being brought together, and the judge kind of finally hears this whole big storyline that each team, each side in the trial is trying to present and trying to build their argument off of. So obviously, like if the introduction says something like, for example, last year for karate, we kind of went with this puppeteer topic, and it was in the introduction and it was in the conclusion. But a lot of feedback that we got was that it wasn't really in the questions that we were writing or the answers that we were giving. So it's really important to kind of extend that throughout the trial so the judge kind of keeps it in their mind rather than hearing it like for the first time in closing or hearing it just for the second time after the introduction in closing, because the closing is like kind of supposed to bring everything all together rather than like establishing new points. So you should be trying to think like back once again, like back to the big picture of things. How can this answer support closing? How is like this witness playing a piece in the storyline that closing is going to have to put together at the end of the trial? So that's really important. You should obviously like talk to the closing attorney, ask them like what they're looking for in the witnesses' responses. And additionally, like you should be ready to change up your questions based on the arguments that your opponents are making. So obviously you're not going to hear clear like we are making this argument, but you should always be listening to the questions that your opponents are asking because it really makes it obvious what kind of arguments they're going for and like what they're trying to tell the judge from their questions. And you should be like trying to change up your questions in response to those so that the closing can still make the strong arguments that they want to without being like counteracted by the arguments that the opposing side is trying to make.
So we gave a lot of information when it comes to what you should look for, things you should do, things you should look out for. And so after this, we're going to give a couple of just tips and tricks, really quick facts that if you take anything from this video, you should take these specific topics. So the first one is to read through everything. And this means fact situations, main witnesses, every witnesses on both sides, just because in order to give a full story, in order to give a story that you want, you need to know all the information. You need to know all the facts that are given to you. And you need to know what facts you want and what facts you don't want. And of course, this adds to our entire talk about, it's at the end of the day, we're all working together as a team. Your story, your DX, CXs, all the questions, all the answers need to work together to contain one story. And in order to do that, you need to know all the information, even if you yourself only take part in a really small part of that. And of course, the second one is you're given evidence. And of course, this may seem obvious, but a lot of the times when you're just straight up reading through a witness statement, it's very easy to see like big chunks of obvious facts that you guys will be able to use, or as we talked about, the generic ones that everyone sees. But at the end of the day, if you look more into the specific lines, if you look at the wording, if you look at specific, words, phrases, they tell you a lot. And a lot of times those are the unique ones that bring you up, or those are the unique ones that the other team doesn't realize, doesn't see, doesn't prepare for. And those are the ones that bring you forward. And the third one, pretrial. So with pretrial, it's really easy to think of pretrial as like a separate island, since a lot of the times we don't work as prosecution and defense, you don't work with pretrial, and your goals seem different, but at the end of the day, we're still a team, we're all working for the same goal. So sometimes working with them, talking with them, knowing what they're doing can tell you more about the evidence that you guys are looking at, whether which evidence you should focus on, which ones, what point they all bring. And so working with pretrial is also important. Fourth one, closing attorneys. As a summary of what we've talked about with closing attorneys are the ones that make the final point. They're the ones that connect all the evidence we are bringing. And of course, in order for you to bring all the evidence, everyone has to be connected. Everyone needs to know what their point is in the story, what they are trying to prove specifically in that story. And so all the stories need to connect in order for the closing attorney to be able to make that final tie. But in order to do that, you need to know what closing attorneys are doing. Closing attorneys also need to know what you're doing. The fifth one, the big picture. So this is just, everything with how everything's going to tie together, how every question is going to work, how all your motivations for why you're asking all these questions, what point you're trying to make. It's all connected. So you have to know what the point is of asking these questions. You need to know what the point is of your witness, of your attorney, of your DX, of your CX. All of that needs to connect at the end. So you need to know what the big picture is. And the last thing is ask for help. So we're all here to help. We all want to get to the same goal. So if there's anything you don't know, whether that's something super basic from like the case packet, or whether like it's some analysis point that you don't understand, just ask, because everything is building off of each other. So if you don't understand something from the beginning, it's going to be really hard to follow along at the end. So just ask. We're all here to help. So that was our presentation on how to analyze the case packet. Hopefully it'll help later in the season.